Let's jump on to our next article that we're talking about. There's critics of the budget's cost of living measures. They say that they're inflationary. But is this true? Dr. Rod, as an economist, let's talk the Australian budget. Yeah, the Australian federal budget. Yeah, a few weeks ago, it was brought out, and there's a lot of critics that are criticizing this budget because they're all saying that there's all these stupid spending things and all this craziness, and it's only going to cause inflation and all this sort of stuff. What's your take, Dr. Rod, as an economist, on the most recent Australian federal budget?
Well, I'd have to say first that I am critical of it. And look, I've been critical of the federal government budgets for nearly 10 years now. And probably the last one I was fairly happy with was 2014. But most of the media wasn't happy with that one. Look, one of the issues I have, and I have had this issue for a long time, is simply the size of government. And this budget and the forward estimates, they usually make estimates out 4 years, shows that the size of the federal government is just going to get bigger and bigger. It'll amount to some 26% of the economy within 4 years. The cumulative deficits will be about $114 billion. And they, of course, trumpeted the fact that this current fiscal year was going to return a surplus, a very small surplus, largely because of an increase in the tax take. That's partly because iron ore prices are very much higher than they thought they were going to be, as thermal coal prices, and also employment is held up much more strongly than they anticipated. So they ended up with an accidental surplus, and they're not going to have another one of those in the foreseeable future, either by accident or by design. And when the question is the budget going to be inflationary? The fact is we have what economists call a structural budget deficit. And what that means is even at full employment, there will still be a deficit because of the nature of the budget, the way in which the whole thing is structured. And so the budget is always going to impart something of an inflationary bias to the economy. And it's only fairly small because the size of the deficit in terms of our overall production is not all that high, but it's still going to send prices in the wrong direction. And what we really need at the moment is for government to shrink in size, to sort of get out of our business and let us do our business without as much government so-called help as we are getting. And just in reference to the headline that you showed a few minutes ago, Craig, yes, there was a so-called cost of living help to the tune of $14.6 billion, but I would actually question whether that's going to help very much. And look, honestly, when most of the cause of inflation is government policy in the first place, the kind of spending that went on, increasing the unemployment benefit, increasing some assistance to single mums, part of this cost of living, so-called cost of living budget included government subsidising a pay increase for workers in nursing homes and so on for the aged. Well, that's not going to stop the cost of living from rising at all. That's just a ridiculous claim on the part of government, and anybody who believes that, I think, is really pretty silly, quite frankly. So yeah, I'm concerned about the size of the budget. I'm concerned that it's not going to do anything to reduce inflation, and that's what the government should be doing if it is concerned about the cost of living. Of course, the major causes of inflation in Australia are outrageous government spending over the last few years, partly as a result of government policy responses to the COVID pandemic, and then more recently, government policy in relation to climate change, which is driving up energy prices and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. So those are parts of the issue, but one of the other issues, and again, look, I've been focusing on this for quite a few years now. I regularly do commentary on the federal government budget. One of the big issues for me is our very heavy reliance on taxes on production to fund government activities. Over 2/3, around 68% of the total government tax take in the next financial year is going to be taxes on production. Those are mainly personal income taxes and company income taxes. Now, those taxes are a disincentive to production.
Yeah.
We really need to refocus our whole tax system away from taxing production to taxing other things like property and spending. And we haven't really had governments that have had the courage to shift the weight of taxation for many, many years now.
Yeah. So when they're making these budgets, what's their purpose? Like, what's their aim? Is it like, because obviously everyone's arguing like they just do budgets to get votes and stuff like that. Like how much reality is there in that statement, or is that just ignorance? Is there like is there pure purpose of a budget just about inflation, or like what's the actual purpose of doing a budget?
Truth be known, there's a mixture, I think. And yes, there are political motivations, there's no doubt about that. Governments tend to pander to those people who vote for them in their budgets, and that's one of the reasons why, in terms of handouts, most of the new handouts went to people at the lower end of the income spectrum, and they tend to be traditional Labor voters. There are also some very sizable subsidies to much the well-heeled as well. $2 billion going to hydrogen production, and a lot of money going into renewables too, of course. And the main beneficiaries from those kinds of subsidies are some of the richest folk in the land. It's the people in the middle who get squeezed. They pay the bulk of the taxes, and they don't. Well, it's not actually true. They do pay a lot of taxation, and they get very little back in return. Certainly in this particular budget. So yes, political motivations are part of it, but look, politicians are not all about themselves. Obviously, there's a lot that they do in order to become re-elected, but the truth is that they do have ideological positions which they use the budget to solidify. And this particular government has a very strong ideological position in relation to global warming, and as a result, they are moving very rapidly to transition the Australian economy from coal and gas power stations to renewables without nuclear. So they're placing very heavy reliance in the short term on wind and solar generation backed up by batteries, and also by increasing the power, the transmission wires, so that, as they say, the sun's always shining and the wind's always blowing somewhere in Australia. So they want to connect it all together, and they're going to spend billions and billions. I think it's about $20 billion on building new transmission infrastructure. But many of the critics, of course, say that we really need some nuclear in the mix if we want to have reliable and continually cheaper electricity. So the ideological position of the particular political party in power will also shine through in the budget. We have a Labor government which I think has quite strong socialist leanings, and that's one of the reasons why, for example, they're going to subsidise a 15% increase in the salary of aged care workers. And there are lots of other subsidies in there. So they're socialising a lot of industry as well. The $2 billion which is being used to aid in the production of so-called clean hydrogen, another $500 million or so to increase the efficiency of dwellings and so on. There's a lot of money they're spending, which will tend to socialise both the private production sector, business, and households, and that's fairly consistent with what Labor does whenever they're in power. And then the third strand of things is they genuinely do some things which are good for the country as well. And in some senses, one of the things that they're trying to do, for example, is to shore up defence. And unusually for a Labor government, they're actually increasing defence spending as a proportion of our total production, of our GDP, gross domestic product. It's going to rise to around 2.3%. As I say, that's very unusual for Labor, but they do recognise that we're living in significantly more dangerous times than has been the case for the last 30 or 40 years. And I think that's a good thing. And I don't know that they've been applauded for doing that in many quarters. So the budget is predicated at least on those three things: the political interest of the government, their ideological position, but they also do some things which are genuinely in the national interest.
Yeah. Okay. So this article started off by talking about that there's critics of this budget, and obviously everyone's always going to be critical of a government, of government spending money, and government spending money on someone else, right? Like, because it does seem to be a lot of that. Now, I looked through some of the kind of like the highlights of the things that they were spending the money on, and it did seem to be a lot of stuff that was just pandering to particular people, but not actually making a difference for those people, right? Like there was one that was like, it's $40 difference or something like that a month to someone or whatever, like just little things like that. But the government, I suppose, are used to critics, but it was really interesting when it was first released that there was all this criticism and there was zero response from the government. Zero response. That seems to be a technique, right? Like that's what I kind of got out of this is like, first of all, it was important for us, I think, for us to understand the budget and us as leaders. So I thank you for explaining that a little bit more, Dr. Rob. But I felt like the leadership lesson for me was just sometimes just don't respond. So how can a government do something like this, that they're going to spend, the budget is just, this is what we're spending our money on. They get a bunch of criticism and then they just don't respond. They ignore and just go on. How do you rate that as a leadership principle?
Look, sometimes I think that is a sensible thing to do. You're not under any particular obligation to respond to critics, I don't think. It really depends on whether or not it's in your interests or another important, say, segment of the community's interest to do so. And clearly the government doesn't feel pressured to respond. I might add that most of the media has given the government a pretty easy ride. They're not really being asked the hard questions. And where fairly hard questions are being asked, they simply don't respond. And I know that there are conservative programs, for example, where they'd love to grill the Treasurer and the Prime Minister on some of these policies. They don't respond to them, and there's no pressure that comes from the general media to do so. So they've been given a fairly easy ride, in my opinion. But look, sometimes it is fair and reasonable not to respond. And look, if I was the Treasurer, my response to the criticism would probably say, well, so tell us what you would have done. The leader of the opposition had an opportunity. There's what we call the budget reply speech, which the leader of the opposition delivers. He did. And look, he pointed out most of the criticisms that I've made already. But what he did also was to put nuclear on the table, nuclear power generation. Yep. And that's the first time that the opposition has actually done that. They didn't do it when they were in government. And that's possibly one of the reasons why they lost the election. But certainly, look, one of the main sources of inflation is the cost of energy. Make no bones about it. And the leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, said we need to have a discussion about putting nuclear in the mix. I think he's right. I think he's received a fair bit of support for that position. The problem that the Labor government has, its official Labor Party policy not to go nuclear, despite the fact that we're going to build nuclear submarines. We don't seem to want to build nuclear power stations. And for those who are not aware, Australia has actually had a nuclear reactor for some 60 years at Lucas Heights in Sydney. And that nuclear reactor, there was a new one brought in to operation there. That's probably about a decade ago now. So we've actually had 60 years of experience with a small nuclear reactor, which produces nuclear medicines in the main for use in Australia. So we do have a small nuclear reactor, and we've had one in Australia for some 60 years. We'll soon have nuclear-powered submarines. And so really, it's very sensible for us to start talking about nuclear power if we're going to say no more thermal power generation using either coal or gas.
So how do you decide when is the right time not to respond to critics and just keep going about your business versus when's the right time that we should respond to critics?
Look, most of the time, if you can, don't respond straight away. Give yourself some time to think before you make a response. Now, that's not always easy to do, of course, when there's some kind of doorstop interview, you're getting out of a car and, there are reporters all around. But, look, if I was a politician, and I'm not, but I'd tend to say, look, I'll make a statement a little later this afternoon and I'll let you know what time I'm going to make that statement. You see, you're never under obligation to respond right away. And I think that's one thing that people in the public eye often forget. You don't have to make a response straight away. Give yourself some time. Say, yep, I will respond. I will respond at 2:00 this afternoon or whatever. I know I have been involved in some fairly ticklish kinds of situations in my employment in the past, where I was approached by reporters, and my usual response was to say, look, I promise I'll ring you back in 10 minutes. I'm too busy to respond right now. And that's what I did. Now, that gave me a little bit of time to sit down and just jot down a few points or gather a bit of data or go and see someone to get some of the latest information so I could respond more fully to the questions that were being put to me. Now, in most cases, we were dealing with the print media. It's a different environment today with social media, of course.
Yeah.
But look, I think in most circumstances, it is possible for you to say, no, I'm not giving you a response right away, but I will give you a response a little later on, and I'll let you know what time that will be. Generally speaking, you don't have an obligation to respond to anybody right away.
I love that. You do not have an obligation to respond right away. I think that's actually important. Sometimes we let our results be the response. Other times we do need a considered response, and so therefore it's better to take that time to consider it. As you're saying that, Doctor, a few ideas ran through my mind, like just a simple thing of sometimes when we're responding to a situation and sending an email, sometimes it's best to leave that email in draft for 24 hours or something like that. Or like I have in many situations, I've needed to respond to something. I've sent it to you first for you to review, you to run your eyes over, and then give me some feedback on it afterwards for me to send properly. That's kind of one practical way I was thinking about it. I was even just sending an email today of having an issue with Facebook, as probably many business owners would. They've added some random charges on my account. I'm disputing those. I've given them the facts. Just like with Trump, I gave them the facts, and their email back to me was like just almost a stock standard carbon copy of their previous response, and didn't even acknowledge any of my facts. And so in response, I was in the middle of something. I'm like, I'll just respond quickly. And I just went, if you don't remove these charges, I'll report you to the ACCC and blah, blah, blah. I was very aggressive. And luckily I got interrupted and went about my day. And then afterwards I'm like, I'll do one more soft email before we go hard on the ACCC threat, but sometimes it is better for us just to take time to consider our response, get rid of the emotion out of it, so that then we can respond with advice as well, getting advice. So I see that's very important, that we don't have to respond straight away. And another real practical thing that I probably share with you is one thing that I do with my clients is most of my clients, if they've got questions, they'll send me a voice note rather than calling me. And because I tell them it's much better for you to send me a voice note so I can get all the facts, hear your tone, hear your emotions, and know everything about you, what you're going through. And then I can listen to it in my time when I'm free, and then I can consider my response, and then I record a voice note back and forwards. Now, sometimes I'll spend hours going back and forwards with clients with voice notes, even longer, sometimes 3-4 hours. And I prefer that than being on a phone call and having to respond straight away to some things. It just allows me to be a little bit more considered. So as Dr. Rod said, make sure that you're aware you have zero commitment to respond immediately. If someone asks you a question you can't answer, it's okay for you to say, that's a great question. Let me consider it and I'll get back to you with an appropriate answer. And maybe there's some, maybe put some emails in draft and maybe ask for some of your clients or staff members if you can get back to them with some of their questions that they have, so you can be more considered, more strategic in your response to critics or any other challenges you may face as a leader. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you've liked that, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any thoughts of how it challenged or helped your leadership, put a comment below, and we'd be honored if you would consider subscribing for more leadership content. Also, make sure you check out the playlist for more episodes like this.